Shabbat Shalom. Seems to be coming through pretty good. Sounds loud to me, but one of the interesting or significant things as you travel through the Torah, particularly the parts where the children of Israel are involved with leaving Egypt and going through the wilderness, is how every passage, every parsha, the Israelites keep doing the same things. And when you look at human history, we keep doing the same things. Things that don't work. I get puzzled by this, and then I watch myself and I notice there's something in human beings that we can do it wrong, didn't work, give us a little time, and we do it again. And one of the things, and we'll look at Exodus 15, start with verse 22. There's a very important passage here, but I was thinking about this, and I was fairly exasperated because, you know, I look at the condition of the country right now, and we're enmeshed in problems, but the number one problem we have is we hate each other. And we work hard at hating each other. We study people that will help us hate the people we hate. And we saturate ourselves in it, and we feel virtuous doing it. Because we're the good people and they're the bad people. And I think, well, why are we doing this? And somebody will say, it's never been this bad. And I'll go, well, sorry to tell you. If you read even American history, around the Civil War, and sometimes we forget, there was 50, 60 years at least built up to the Civil War, where it soon became that was all, everyone in the country was defined by you were pro-slavery or anti. That defined everything. But what's amazing if you go back and look at that is the reactions that people have to each other, the way they approach solving problems. Nothing changes. We just keep doing it. And when you look at the scripture, God, he started his plan of redemption through a man named Abraham. Well, it's Abram, actually. And he said that he was going to bless all the nations. And we've seen a lot of blessing in world history, but we see these recurrent patterns that are so toxic and so destructive. And we seem helpless in the face of them. So we're going to read this, Exodus 15, verse 22. This is right after they came through the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, probably more properly. And they've seen the Egyptians destroyed. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now just stop with me. Can you imagine walking through this desert with no water for 3 days? There would be nothing else on your mind. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Then he cried out to Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a tree, and he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. There he made for them a statute and regulation, and there he tested them. And he said, "If you will give earnest heed to the voice of Yahweh your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, Yahweh, am your healer." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the waters. I don't think anyone has a problem with them being upset or concerned about not finding water when they're on the desert. Did you catch something? There's a nuance you may have missed here. When they couldn't find water, who did they go to? Went to Moses. Doesn't it say very plainly in your Bible the people grumbled at Moses? But what is the promise? If you will do what? If you will earnestly heed the voice Have you noticed that this pattern hasn't stopped? You get into trouble and you look for the people whose fault it is. And you go to them. And what's the instruction here? If you will listen, and in fact in Hebrew it says Shema, Shema. That, we've talked about this many times, so you know. In English you understand the comparative and the superlative. Something is good, it's better, best. In Hebrew, to get the comparative, you just double the word. So you listen, listening. You earnestly heed. And it's everything they've just gone through. They came to the Red Sea. Once they listened to the voice of God, He told them what to do, they were saved. When they were in Egypt, when they listened to the voice of God, they were saved. And now, there's a part of us that will never respond right. Are you at peace with that? There's something in your nature that is never going to respond the right way. I was vaccinating calves on Wednesday. And I have to give them shots, and then I give them a tattoo, rub ink in the tattoo, and give them an ear tag. This makes them very happy. Some of them don't, about the third time I come to their head, they're getting angry. And this one heifer, she was not having it. She was not going to let me get a hold of her ear, and of course this made me happy. And as I went down to try to put the tattoo in her ear, she swung her head up and smacked me right in the nose. I mean, and you know what I wanted to do? I wanted to kill her. I don't want to hit her. I want her dead. I want her hung on the wall, her hide spread out. I mean, no one else here has ever had these. And just that same day I went over there, Ron was putting up a gate. And something wasn't working right, and I could hear him speaking kind words at the gate. What's going on? What? There's something in us that is, Paul talks in Galatians 5. He said, these are the fruits of the Spirit. And then he described before that the deeds of the flesh. Do you see something very different between deeds and fruits? The flesh has deeds. There are things the flesh does. But the Spirit is something that requires cultivation, and it needs life. If you kill my pear tree, will I have pears this fall? No, the only way I'll have pears this fall is if that tree is alive and it's watered and it's taken care of. Patience. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, they're fruit. But being angry, striking out, responding, revenge, those are deeds. I don't need to be trained to do those. And the children of Israel grumbling about being out of water is normal. You need to drink. But it was interesting, a couple things here. The word that's translated grumble, it's a Hebrew word, loon, or taluna, different variants. You know what it first means? The first meaning of it is to stop. To grumble is to stop. So in other words, when I'm grumbling, what's happening to my progress? I've quit. Grumbling is never about God, other people. It's about me. It's a deed of the flesh. It's something that comes out of somewhere in me that will never change. And trying to improve my flesh is a waste of time. What happens to the flesh of the older generation with Israel? They die. Because God says, I'm not taking, they're not going in. I can't use that. And he fixes it in this story. How many of you are struck? How does Moses fix the bitter water? What is that about? Why would putting a tree in the water make it sweet? You think about that. We'll talk about it a little later. But I was really struck by the fact that the word in Hebrew that is grumble or murmur comes from to stop, to be obstinate, to complain. And I think all of us know that when we're complaining, we've quit. Because now we're no longer concerned about where we're going. We're angry about what we don't have or what we're not getting or what, it's this thing. There are a couple words here that are very important. The grumbling, and the other one is bitterness. If I were to ask you to just bitter, I always think about this when I hit this. Anybody here have a good synonym for bitter? Resentful, yes. I would say resentful works for humans, but just the word itself, bitter. It's even like it's a taste, right? Therefore, and what Pam says is true, that when I'm bitter, that usually means I'm resentful, or many other things, but what is bitter? What? Yeah, it's nasty. Yeah, you want to spit it out. It's something you don't like. So then, let me ask you a question. Anybody here like to be bitter? Is there a soul here that has not experienced bitterness? Where does it come from? Why are these waters bitter? You have to ask yourself these questions, because when you look at 1 Corinthians 10, Paul tells us, and that's our New Testament reading this week, that these things happen, they're historical, but he says they're examples for us so that we won't do what they did in the wilderness. And this is the thing that has struck me as I look at what's going on in the world. We keep doing the things we've always done because we respond to situations in our flesh. And it produces certain responses that produce the results we've always seen that we don't like, but we keep doing it. And Moses solves this by throwing a tree in the water, or a stick. In Hebrew, it's etz. Now, I would think somebody right off the bat would, for Christians, what's the tree in the water? It's the cross. What does it represent? That's the thing I've been thinking about, because Paul says that he decided to know nothing but Yeshua, Jesus, and Him crucified. In another place he says, God forbid that I may glory except what? In the cross of the Messiah, in the cross of Christ. How does the cross fix this? And if you don't kind of ask yourself this, you and I, it's just like me when the animal hit me in the nose. And it was just a couple days before that, there was a cow that we always give them shot. We always give them vaccines before they calve. And we had missed her. We vaccinated them against a couple of things, but one of the particular things is E. coli mastitis. So she'd calved, and I thought, well, I'll just vaccinate her in the milking cow pen. And I walked up to her and gave her a shot. Most cows don't care. This one did. She kicked me right in the knee as hard as she could. And that was that same thing. In the last couple of weeks, to see this happen and to realize I am helpless in my reaction. I can stop and think about it and not act on it, but my first response is to kill her, to do something that hurts twice as much as what she did to me. It's only just. I stuck her with a needle, she said, wham! And I stopped and realized, well, she didn't like the needle. But if we're not able to distinguish, see, the children of Israel, they're without water. It is normal to be thirsty. There's nothing wrong with being thirsty. It's normal to be fearful because you don't know where the water's coming from. What isn't constructive is using that murmuring, that grumbling thing that comes out of us and it turns to bitterness instead of to say, Lord, what are you doing here? What are you saying? But to do that is never from your flesh. That's a fruit that you develop. That love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, that comes, the Lord has planted His Spirit in you, and you take care of it and you keep it alive. There's no fruit growing on a dead tree. If I'm dead spiritually, or if I'm barely alive spiritually, it's unrealistic to think that the fruit will be growing. The bitterness thing is something I've noticed quite a bit in people, and you're all coming up with synonyms. It's a hard word to actually find a synonym, but we recognize it when we see it. And for me, when I see bitterness in a person, bitterness is always hanging on to something that is in the past. It's done, it's over. It is very much this word loom. Stop. A person that's moving on cannot afford to be bitter. Bitterness will keep me locked. If I have a situation with Dean, with Pam, Joy, Ann, doesn't matter who it is, and I never move on beyond that, that becomes bitterness. And it may get so bad that I can't even see or talk or have anything to do with that person. And in that area of my life, I'm frozen. But the interesting thing is how the flesh will always take insult, injury, and turn it into bitterness. This is a very real thing. And you probably haven't thought about it, but I'll remind you right now. Who is the person that led Israel in the dance after they went through the Red Sea? Miriam. Where does her name come from? It's Mara. Her name means bitterness. What is the name of the mother of Yeshua? It's Miriam. Greek Mary, but Yeshua would have called her Miriam. That was her name. It's Mara. What came out of this? Who else wanted to be called Mara? Naomi. We just went through the story of Ruth, right? And what came out of her desire to be bitter? It's an amazing story because it's a story of redemption. It reminds us of what the tree does. Ruth is a person who is forever banned from belonging to the congregation. But she comes and she says, I'm no longer a Moabitess. Your people are my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. I'm choosing to be part of you. And out of her a completely redemptive response, the bitterness is turned to sweetness. And the woman who has no heir in Israel has the line of David and ultimately the line of Yeshua. So there's something powerful about the way we process life. Insult. The grumbling turning to bitterness or redemption that somehow involves the tree. And I have a lot of sympathy for the children of Israel in this situation because, and I bet you everyone here has, have you ever been so thirsty you thought you would die? Can you imagine being in that situation and not knowing where a drink is coming from? and someone telling you, be positive, look up, it'll work out. You know, and yet, how does the Spirit respond? It's always a challenge to me to know how you deal with the flesh, because the appetites that God put in our flesh are not bad. The problem with them is allowing them to reign over us or to rule us. Because you need to get hungry, you need to be tired, you need to be thirsty. That's how you tell your body. Even pain is a good thing. It tells us what you just did was probably the wrong thing to do, or you stepped on the wrong thing, or maybe at my age, I'm starting to notice pain places where I've maybe used something too much. My profession, putting in embryos, takes a lot of manipulation, and my left thumb is getting to the place I can hardly stand it. And it's telling me something. It's telling me, you better figure out how to take care of me, or I'm going to let you down. It's nothing to be mad about, nothing to be angry about, not to curse my thumb. But it is, what's my first reaction again? Do it. But don't let a little pain stop you. When you look at this whole concept, grumbling, murmuring, Bill Johnson said something that really comes right out of the writings. In fact, if you've never, I would suggest that you listen to it's about a 35 or 40 minute sermon he gave on grumbling, on murmuring. But he said, if God inhabits the praises of his saints, who inhabits their grumbling? That's an awful scenario. But what does it say in the writings? That murmuring or grumbling is attention to the adversary of the soul. And that really brought me up short, but how do we deal redemptively with our flesh that God gave us? And you need to be careful that you separate your body from your fleshly impulses. And Paul says one place, I know that in my flesh is no good thing. And he's not saying my body is bad or your body is bad. But he's saying the reactions that happen. And I've talked about it many times that when you look at Pharaoh, he's not so much a picture of the devil as he's a picture of your carnal nature. That nature that, like I said, the cow smacks me in the nose, I want to hurt it back. And I want to hurt it worse. I want it to know that it made me suffer, and it needs to suffer because it made me suffer, and after all, I'm the most important human on the planet. No one ever goes through all those words, but they certainly, that's how we respond. And God sets Israel free from Pharaoh, but he sets them free from Pharaoh by bringing them into his kingdom. There's an idea in the world that you can be free with no boundaries, no restraints. That's not freedom. It's death. There's no organism, no human, nothing that can exist in a condition of absolute license. I love the example that Danny Litvin gave. He said there was a man who longed to be, and he felt bound to the earth. So he got in a spaceship. And he got in, the spaceship took him up, and he was orbiting the earth, and he said, I'm still not free. I'm in this spaceship. And so he got out of the spaceship in his spacesuit and was looking out on all that was out there in front of him, stars, the earth. And he says, you know what? I'm still bound. I'm still constrained. I'm in this spacesuit. So he took off the spacesuit. And he was free. And he was dead. And it's interesting that people think there's such a thing as freedom without some kind of boundary. God does not set us free from Pharaoh's kingdom to just be flying through space aimlessly. He takes us from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of His Son, into the kingdom of light. And being in God's boundaries is what brings us joy and fulfillment. It's not in being, quote, set free. It's being free, but it's per God's definition. When you look at the story that we're looking at right now, this in the wilderness, it reveals something, because being thirsty is normal. We have to have water to live. If you don't drink, you won't live. My mom went an extraordinary number of days without water, and I don't suggest it. In general, they say 5 days, and you're teetering on death's door. So you have to have water. The issue is, my need for water, is that going to allow me, is it going to force me to act out of my flesh, my carnal nature, or can I be redeemed enough to say, Lord, what are you doing? What are you saying? How do I respond to this? And I would submit that the flesh is reflexive. Anybody here ever been to the doctor's office and they make you sit on a table or something, then they take that little hammer and hit the tendon below your patella? What does your leg do? I mean, do you think about it? No, it is interesting, though. You have to relax. If you're tense, that won't work. But reactions, reflexes, are not spiritual. They're not bad, but they're not spiritual. Thus, if I'm in the kingdom of God, I have to find a way through Yeshua, through Jesus, that He becomes the Lord of my reflexes, and my reflexes are not the Lord of my life. And when you look a lot of what's going on in the world today that's so painful and so toxic, is that people are being told to follow their reflexes. Follow your appetite. You're hungry, that's normal. Eat what you want. You feel lust, satisfy your lust however you can. You're confused, decide what you are. You know, of all the bizarre things that ever happened, is that we're suddenly telling people that they are who they think they are, even if it flies in the face of reality. And there's a lot of battles right now over it. And a lot of Christians are in the battle, and we're acting as fleshly in the battle as the people we're battling. We're hating each other. People that are that confused, let's be straight here. People who are men that think they're women, or women who think they're men, do not need our censure or condemnation. They're confused, really confused. What would you say if I got up here and said I was a rabbit? You'd say I was a jackalope. He's from Wyoming. But see, we're laughing because we know, I know, and you know, I'm not a rabbit. I'm not a jackalope. I'm a person. And to me, when I see what's happening at that level, I get the feeling that our culture has stopped answering questions for people that used to be answered. And people are desperately searching for meaning. And they're being told that in their flesh, in their impulses, in their reflexes, they will find salvation. And they won't. What they'll find is the bitter water. They can't drink it. They're dying of thirst, and they're being taken to a place where they go to drink it, and they can't drink it. It's bitter. And no one is putting the tree in the water for them. There's so many things as you go through this story, and you find all through this history, you find the children of Israel grumbling, and then you find this bitterness. Grumbling and bitterness. And bitterness In a chemical sense, we might use the word acrid. Yes, stringent. Something that I think we all know that if we took a potion that was too bitter, it would actually hurt us. It would destroy us. And yet, humans deal with bitterness, and it's hard to know how to get rid of it. But sometimes what happens is I'm trying to find a solution for bitterness in my flesh when my flesh is what produced the bitterness. See, there's a law, and I think it's Newton's third law. I had to look this up because I never can remember it. And that is, to every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's why when the cow hits me, my first reaction is hit it. What good is it? I remember another time a cow was really bothering me. I was trying to lead her someplace, and she kept trying to run over the top of me. And a lot of times the good thing to do is just kind of pop them on the nose so they'll slow down. Well, she kept, and I turned around to pop her on the nose, and she turned her head, and I hit her right here above her eye on the orbit. That's hard on a cow. It broke those two little bones in my hand. And this wasn't too long before one of the meetings we had in Salt Lake. I was supposed to play the piano. You ever played the piano with two broken, what are those bones? I have to think here. Carpals, metacarpals. Don't break your metacarpals and then try to play the piano. But funny little story to remind you, the flesh reacts and it never does what's good for it. That thing where someone hits you, you want to hit it back, the wrench pops you in the nose and you scream at it, that the reaction of your flesh, the equal and opposite reaction, is opposed to you. It doesn't want you to live. It's death. That's why Proverbs says there's a way that seems right to a man, and the ways are the ways of death. And someone tells you, you'll hear things, oh, it's so hard to follow the Lord. I've decided to follow Jesus. I had to give up everything, and it's so difficult. It's a lie. He said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And it's real. But you and I are tasked as we look through these stories, how do we turn the bitter into sweet? Remember what Isaiah said? Woe to those who call good evil and evil good, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. That's another thing that's happening in our culture today, and people are telling me, well, God said this is terrible, but it's good. He says don't eat of that tree, but if you do, it'll be good. You'll enjoy it. There's an old story. It's in the Talmud or the Mishnah, one of those books. And you never know where these old stories come from. And I would never say that they're literally true, but they're true. You get that? And my Jewish guide that told me all stories are true, some actually happened. But when Miriam was a girl, this is the sister of Aaron and Moses, she had a prophetic word that said that from her mom and dad would come the seed that would save Israel. And then Pharaoh made this edict that all the baby boys would be cast in the water, and Yocheved and Amram and Jochebed separated. They said, we're not going to make kids to have them thrown in the Nile. And she came to them and said, you have now not only condemned the baby boys, but you've condemned the baby girls, because there will be no children. And so they came back together. And then Moses was born. And anyway, the story is kind of amazing. And where it came from, I don't know, but it's interesting that Moses is very much a type of Yeshua. He's very much a type of Jesus. And Jesus, of course, like I told you, was born to Miriam. But in Exodus 1, it reminds us that Israel was embittered by slavery. Why would slavery make you bitter? The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. Here's something that I believe is true that came to me. Bitterness is not a choice. What does John mean? He's nuts. Not being bitter is a choice. You do not need to choose to be bitter. That will happen totally naturally. The children of Israel, they were bitter. The slavery was difficult. Their baby boys were being thrown in the Nile. Bitterness was a reaction. It was just as normal as when the hammer hits you on the knee and your leg flies. Bitterness is normal. It's a reaction. You'll find all kinds of reasons why you're bitter. Not being bitter is a choice. You will not naturally not be bitter. You will choose not to be bitter. There's so much of this that goes through the scripture. And I mentioned to you about the tree, but it's interesting to me that when you look at Miriam, the mother of Yeshua, Miriam, the sister to Moses, and how they figure prominently in redemption. But when Yeshua is born, and she and Joseph take the baby to the temple, what does Simon tell them about their baby? Mary is told she will be pierced. One of the things, and I remember clear back Harry Deckert talking about this. The tree that was put in the water was sweet for the Israelites, but it was bitter for God. He took their bitterness. When Yeshua died on the cross, it was extremely bitter for him. But it's what brings us salvation. The bitterness goes someplace. And, you know, there's a couple of places where trees will show up. Or I thought it was interesting that in Ezekiel 37, where it talks about the two sticks. And remember, that chapter starts off with the children of Israel being dead, and so dead that they're skeletons. They're not just dead. They're dry bones. There's nothing on them. And God asks Ezekiel an interesting question. He says, "Can these bones live?" And of course, Ezekiel is a smart man. He says, "Lord, you alone know." Because my first reaction would be, no. Because when I see bones that are dry and bleached, I know it's not only dead, it's real dead. He prophesies to the bones and they stand on their feet. You know, the sinews come together. He prophesies breath. They stand on their feet, a mighty army. And then he goes on to tell the same story in a different way. Here's the dry bones, dead on the desert floor, brought to their feet, resurrected. Then he tells the story this way. He says, take a stick, write on it for Joseph and his companions. Another stick for Judah and his companions. Bring the sticks together, and what happens? Resurrection. The two become one. See, when you look at the problems in the world today, and one of the things that drive me crazy is I'm starting to realize in the flesh we cannot get along. We can't. I've got all these friends on Facebook. A lot of them are actually my friends. And they're constantly telling me of the evil of their opponents. And they're making up stories. They are literally making stuff out of whole cloth. And the more they spread it, the more real it becomes. And they're coming to this place where salvation will be when they obliterate their enemies. That's not how it happens. Yeshua did not redeem me by obliterating me. He should have. I deserved it. But he died for me. He laid his life down. He became a curse. There's nothing more accursed than someone who's hung on a tree. When you start thinking that we're going to make the world a better place by demolishing our opponents, you and I are in our flesh. And out of this comes bitterness, anger, revolts, sex, not S-E-X, S-E-C-T-S. Both, actually. And God says, no, we're going to put a tree in the water. Look at Zechariah 12. I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him, as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him, like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. In that day there will be great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadad-Dramon in the plain of Megiddo. That's Armageddon. The land will mourn, every family by itself, the family of the house of David by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Nathan by itself, their wives by themselves. The family of the house of Levi by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the Shimeites by itself, and their wives by themselves. All the families that remain, every family by itself, and their wives by themselves. Zechariah has this vision where he sees all these families, particularly the Jews in Jerusalem, and they're going to look on someone that they've pierced. They did something that pierced, and they're going to mourn. What comes out of this? In that day, a fountain will be opened for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for impurity. The idea that we are going to fix the problems in the world by getting people to see it our way and making them agree with us. We've got 6,000 years that doesn't work. And what's more, when God came down here and said, I see what a mess you're making of things, John. I see how, left to your own devices, what comes out of this. I've got a solution. And oddly enough, it's not going to be smashing you. It's going to be letting you see what your sin does to someone who's completely innocent. Someone who, instead of retaliating, instead of reflexing, instead of coming out of his flesh, out of his spirit will come love for hatred. Will come kindness for revenge. It utterly takes the law of for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and it kills the law. Because the law goes bang, no response. That's not of this world. You ask these kids that have taken science. No, in every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. You can't make it stop. It goes on and on and on and on. And yet God instituted the cross that said, this one will become a curse. And when you see the one who was pierced for you, then a fountain, a cleansing fountain will come forth. Have you ever seen a time in our history where we needed a fountain for cleansing and impurity like our nation needs today? It's always bothered me when I'd read Paul say things like, all alike are under the law. And it almost sounds like he says the law is a bad thing. But I realize he's not saying the law is a bad thing. He's just saying based on the law, there's no hope for any of us. Unless you're not like me. Now, I say, I have known the Lord basically my whole life. I love what Jessica said here a few times ago. And she said people would ask her, well, when were you saved? And she'd say, I love this. She said, I didn't know there was an option. I've never not known Jesus. I never knew there was any other way. And no, that's me too. And yet, I'm confident that I've been born of the Spirit. I'm confident I'm baptized of the Spirit. But I'm also confident that I still have that fleshly nature that wants to smack that cow. And when somebody crosses me, I also still have the nature that I'm trying to figure out a way to get them. Now, fortunately, most of the time, it kicks in fast enough that I don't do anything, but not always. I don't know about the rest of you, but my tongue is connected to my insanity. And things that should never be said somehow find their way out of my mouth. I desperately need something that stops this cycle. I need something that, bang, no bang back. You know, Paul goes through this, and he's talking about the law, and he's saying the law is holy, spiritual, and good, but he said, it didn't do anything for me. He said there's the law that says, you shall not covet. What did Paul say happened to him when the law told him not to covet? He says, sin seized that opportunity to make me instantly want Dave's car or whatever else he's got that I want. You know, before I was just fine. And then, John, don't covet. Psst, I see all this stuff I want. And Paul says, what am I going to do? This isn't working. He says, thanks be to God for Yeshua the Messiah, for Jesus Christ. He says, it's my only hope. The problem we have right now is that people are thinking if they introduce people to their idea of Jesus, their idea of Yeshua, if we can get them born again, it will fix all this. It's not working. Because we're not introducing them to the real Messiah. We're not introducing them to a Messiah that says, okay, now lay your life down for your enemies. We're introducing people to someone who will make them feel good about their sins. Well, I'm saved now. We're all good. There will be no peace under the law. As long as peace is coming on the attributes, the statutes of law, there will never be peace because somewhere along the line we will violate the conditions. Peace will only come when we lay our lives down and stop taking them. And when you look at that tree going in the water, we take advantage of God's mercy. And the children of Israel did. They drank the water. It was sweet. And that's good. Yeah, you should. But then we live in a way that keeps producing bitterness. We live in a way that keeps producing strife and brokenness. And you know, I honestly think that we live in a time when God wants to redeem mankind. He wants to redeem the time we're in. And I wish I had the answers. I don't have the answers, but I have the one who has the answers. And one of the things I'm confident of, you know, there's this wonderful scripture my dad liked to read this one in 2 Corinthians 5. It's one everybody can quote. And it's good you can. I'm going to start with verse 16. From now on, therefore, we regard no one according to the flesh. Even though we once regarded Christ according to the flesh, we regard him thus no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, if anyone's in the Messiah, he's a new creation. The old has passed away, behold, the new has come. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Did you catch what he said there? He said that he reconciled men to himself, not counting their sins against them. And he made us messengers of reconciliation. How are you expecting that you and I are going to be reconciled to each other? Stop counting their sins against them. Where does bitterness come from? When I'm truly bitter against someone or something, what have I been doing? I've been counting up, toting up their sins against me. Have you ever had somebody that something happened, you're hurt, and every time you see them, you can run through this list of offenses? That's bitterness. And Paul says that God, through the Messiah, gave us the message of reconciliation, and he made us messengers of reconciliation, and we spread this message by not counting people's sins against them. Are you going to try to do that in your flesh? Well, good luck. Your flesh loves those lists. Your flesh rejoices in knowing everything they did that hurt you. It shows what a sound discernment you've got. You can remember all this stuff. And the Spirit comes along and says, sorry, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience. And it's time to lay that down. It's amazing to me that God has given the house of Levi and Aaron the job. One of our major jobs is to help unite the body. Is to help people learn to get along. Is to help people see that not all differences are because the other people are bad. Sometimes there are differences just because you have a different place in the body. Sometimes the differences are sin. Either way, the response is to stop and say, if you will listening to the voice of the Lord. And I think a great prayer is, Lord, here I am, the water is bitter. Help me put the tree in the water. What do I do? How do I supersede the law and to this action respond in a way that, it's a little bit like if you punch something and it moves away from you, can you ever hit it? Yeah. And in a lot of ways, that's what the cross does. The cross takes away the offense. I sometimes get very unhappy with Christianity because I see how we failed. And yet, through Christianity, the witness of who the Messiah is remains. I was going to share that sermon by Bill Johnson on Facebook, and then I realized I better not, because all these friends that the minute they saw Bill Johnson, they would be attacking him as a cult. And they wouldn't listen to the message, which is awesome, because he points out what grumbling does and where it leads and all this, but no. And I just was reading another thing about, what do they call the Indian schools in Canada? There weren't much, we had the same thing here. And we instituted these schools because the Indian culture was inferior and we wanted to remove the Indian culture from these kids. And primarily these schools were run by religious people. It was illegal to speak the native language. Sadly, and not everyone was like this, sadly a lot of these were run by Catholics, and many of the priests abused the kids at just a horrific level. They wouldn't abort the children sometimes, they would kill the children. Or make the girls that had, it's the most incredible abomination that happened. In a sense, this is an indictment of Christianity because we allowed Christianity, now certainly this isn't how Yeshua, Jesus is, but we allowed it to be something that was this idea up in our head, but we could still keep acting out of our flesh. And there are examples after examples after examples. And you realize it's not an indictment of the Bible. It's not an indictment of Yeshua. It's an indictment of human nature. And sometimes I would like it to be that all the Christians are perfect and everything's, And yet I realize that God's working with what He's got. This is the raw material He's given us. And so, as I bring this to a close, and a lot of rambling, I guess the simple thing I would say to you today, in your world, politically, spiritually, religiously, where you work, ask God to allow you, we're called to follow Yeshua, to call Jesus everywhere He went. How can you and I take time to listen to Him and be an agent for putting the tree in the water? Did the children of Israel deserve to have the tree in the water? Not at all. Why did God do it? He loved them. He wanted them to have a drink. I honestly think it would have been a lot nicer if they'd have stopped and said, Lord, what can we do? Which is, of course, what Moses did. And I've learned, at least I'm learning. I haven't learned, let's be honest. Be careful how much of the news you absorb yourself in. It's great to know what's going on in the world. Be careful that you don't listen to all these rehearsals of what's wrong with people, what's wrong with society, what's wrong with the Democrats, what's wrong with the Republicans. Because if you aren't careful, you'll notice a lot of what goes on in the world that's supposed to be news is actually a rehearsal getting you to be mad at somebody. That's not the message of reconciliation. I don't think we're called to be ignorant. But again, as I come back to this, and I've thought about it all week, and I know I don't even close to have the words for it, but there's something that God did on the cross that says when you pour sin out on it, you can't get anything back but who God is. It's not reactive. It's not instantaneous. It's not expected. It's supernatural. It's redemptive. And He's made us messengers of reconciliation. That's what we do. It's a very hopeful time, even though at times you might not think so. And another thing I've noticed too, if you look for it, there's some people now putting out redemptive stories, good things that are happening. Somebody on Facebook was in the grocery store, and there was an older lady in a wheelchair, and she was by the dairy section. And she needed something that was on the top shelf, and she couldn't reach it, and she was looking around for help, and this black fellow came over and he says, Mom, what can I do for you? He opened the door, got everything she needed, took her to the next place she needed to go. He didn't have any idea this person was watching, and they took a picture of him getting this stuff for her. And there was just something beautiful and redemptive about, he was just being a blessing. And I realize this is happening everywhere. It's happening all over. But I want to focus on that. I want to see that. And be careful of the voices that tell us that we hate each other, which sometimes I keep telling you. We don't have to. We started 10 minutes early. We're going to end 10 minutes early. How's that? That's also redemptive, right? Tell you jokes for the next 10 minutes? I don't know. I knew that was coming. That's as bad as the joke I read to you this morning, that the kind way to tell someone they're stupid is that wisdom has been chasing you, but you have always been faster. Let's all stand. Joey, would you close for us, please?
Father, we just are thankful to have this opportunity to just gather together in your name. We just pray, Father, that you will help us to be more like you, and that we'll be able to follow after the Holy Spirit, and that we'll be reminded often throughout the week as we go about our days that it's really going back to the cross this year, the sacrifice that you made for us on the cross. And just continue to just be aware of that and to listen to his voice and keep his commandments. And the fruit in our lives will continue to just be a wonderful harvest. We just say this in Yeshua's name.
Amen.